Story 21 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Open Door by S. Mukherjee. Here again is something that is very peculiar and not very uncommon. We, myself and 3 friends of mine, were asked by another friend of ours to pass a week's holiday at the suburban residence of the last named. We took an evening train after the office hours and reached our destination at about 10:30 that night. The place was about 60 miles from Calcutta. Our host had a very large house with a number of disused wings. I do not think many of my readers have any idea of a large residential house in Bengal. Generally it is a quadrangular sort of thing, with a big yard in the center which is called the Angan or Uthan, a courtyard. On all sides of the courtyard are rooms of all sorts of shapes and sizes. There are generally 2 stories, the lower used as kitchen, go-down, storeroom, etc., and the upper as bedrooms, etc. Now this particular house of our friend was of the kind described above. It stood on extensive grounds wooded with fruit and timber trees. There was also a big tank, a miniature lake in fact, which was the property of my friend. There was good fishing in the lake, and that was the particular attraction that had drawn my other friends to this place. I myself was not very fond of angling. As I have said, we reached this place about 10:30 at night. We were received very kindly by the father and the mother of our host, who were a very jolly old couple, and after a very late supper, or shall I call it dinner, we retired. The guest rooms were well furnished and very comfortable. It was a bright moonlight night, and our plan was to get up at 4 in the morning and go to the lake for angling. At 3 in the morning the servants of our host woke us up. They had come to carry our fishing gear, and we went to the lake, which was a couple of 100 yards from the house. As I have said, it was a bright moonlight night in summer, and the outing was not unpleasant after all. We remained on the bank of the lake till about 7 in the morning, when one of the servants came to fetch us for our morning tea. I may as well mention here that breakfast in India generally means a pretty heavy meal at about 10 a.m. I was the first to get up, for I have said already that I was not a worthy disciple of Isaac Walton. I wound up my line and walked away, carrying my rod myself. The lake was towards the back of the house. To come from the lake to the front of it we had to pass along the whole length of the buildings. See rough plan above. As would appear from the plan, we had to pass along the shady footpath, A, B, C, D, E. There was a turning at each point, B, C, D, and E. The back row of rooms was used for go-downs, storerooms, kitchens, etc. One room, the one with the door marked star, at the corner, was used for storing a number of door frames. The owner of the house, our host's father, had at one time contemplated adding a new wing, and for that purpose the door frames had been made. Then he gave up the idea, and the door frames were kept stored up in that corner room, with a door on the outside marked star. Now as I was walking ahead, I reached the turning B first of all, and it was probably an accident that the point of my rod touched the door. The door flew open. I knew this was an unused portion of the house, and so the opening of the door surprised me to a certain extent. I looked into the room and discovered the wooden door frames. There was nothing peculiar about the room or its contents either. When we were drinking our tea 5 minutes later, I casually remarked that they would find some of the door frames missing, as the door of the room in which they were kept had been left open all night. I did not at that time attach any importance to a particular look in the eyes of the old couple, my host's father and mother. The old gentleman called one of the servants and ordered him to bolt that door. When we were going to the lake in the evening, I examined the door and found it had been closed from the inside. The next morning we went out a-fishing again, and we were returning for our tea at about 7 in the morning. I was again ahead of all the rest. As I came along, this time intentionally I gave a push to the door with my rod. It again flew open. This is funny, I thought. At tea I reported the matter to the old couple, and then I noticed with curiosity their embarrassed look of the day before. I therefore suggested that the servants intentionally left the door open, and one morning they would find the door frames, stored in the room, gone. At this the old man smiled. He said that the door of this particular room had remained open for the last 15 years, and the contents had never been disturbed. On our pressing him why the door remained open, he admitted with great reluctance that since the death of a certain servant of the household in that particular room 15 years ago, the outer door had never remained closed. "You may close it yourself and see," suggested the old gentleman. We required no further invitation. Immediately we all went to that room to investigate, and find out the ghost if he remained indoors during the day. But Mr. Ghost was not there. "He has gone out for his morning constitutional," I suggested, "and this time we shall keep him out." Now this particular room had 2 doors and 1 window. The window and 1 door were on the courtyard side of the room, and communicated with the courtyard. The other door led to the grounds outside, and this last was the haunted door. We opened both the doors and the window and examined the room. There was nothing extraordinary about it. Then we tried to close the haunted door. It had warped probably by being kept open for 15 years. It had 2 very strong bolts on the inside, but the lower bolt would not go within 3 inches of its socket. The upper one was very loose, and a little continuous thumping would bring the bolt down. We thought we had solved the mystery thus. The servants only closed the door by pushing up the upper bolt. At night the wind would shake the door, and the bolt would come down. So this time we took good care to use the lower bolt. 3 of us pushed the door with all our might, and 1 man thrust the lower bolt into a socket. It hardly went in 1/4 of an inch, but still the door was secure. We then hammered the bolt in with bricks. In doing this we broke about 6 of them. This will explain to the reader how much strength it required to drive the bolt in about 1.5 inches. Then we satisfied ourselves that the bolt could not be moved, without the aid of a hammer and a lever. Afterwards we closed the window and the other door, and securely locked the last. Thus no human being could open the haunted door. Before retiring to bed after dinner, we further examined both doors once more. They were all right. The next morning we did not go out for fishing, so when we got up at about 5 in the morning, the first thing we did was go and examine the haunted door. It flew in at the touch. We then went inside and examined the other door and the window which communicated with the courtyard. The window was as secure as we had left it, and the door was chained from the outside. We went round into the courtyard and examined the lock. It did not appear to have been tampered with. The old man and his wife met us at tea as usual. They had evidently been told everything. They, however, did not mention the subject, neither did we. It was my intention to pass a night in that bedroom, but nobody would agree to bear me company, and I did not quite like the idea of passing a whole night in that ugly room. Moreover, my host would not have heard of it. The mystery of the open door has not yet been solved. It was about 20 years ago that what I have narrated above happened. I am not sure that the mystery will ever be solved. In this connection it will not be out of place to mention another incident with regard to another family and another house in another part of Bengal. Once, while coming back from Darjeeling, the summer capital of Bengal, I had a very garrulous old gentleman for a fellow traveller in the same compartment. I was reading a copy of the Occult Review, and the title of the magazine interested him very much. He asked me what the magazine was about, and I told him. He then asked me if I was really interested in ghosts and their stories. I told him that I was. "In our village we have a gentleman who has a family ghost," said my companion. "What kind of thing is a family ghost?" I asked. "Oh, the ghost comes and has his dinner with my neighbour every night," said my companion. "Really? It must be a very funny ghost," I said. "That is a fact. If you stay for a day in my village you will learn everything." I at once decided to break my journey in the village. It was about 2 in the afternoon when I got down at the railway station, procured a hackney carriage, and, ascertaining the name and address of the gentleman who had the family ghost, separated from my old companion. I reached the house in about 20 minutes, and told the gentleman that I was a stranger in those parts, and as such craved leave to pass the rest of the day and the night under his roof. I was a very unwelcome guest, but he could not kick me out, as the moral code would not permit it. He, however, shrewdly guessed why I was anxious to pass the night at his house. Of course, my host was very kind to me. He was a tolerably rich man with a large family. Most of his sons were grown-up young men who were at college in Calcutta. The younger children were of course at home. At night, when we sat down to dinner, I gently broached the subject by hinting at the rumour I had heard that his house was haunted. I further explained to him that I had only come to ascertain if what I had heard was true. He told me, of course it was very kind of him, that the story about the dinner was false, and what really happened was this. I had a younger brother who died 2 years ago. He was of a religious turn of mind, and passed his time in reading religious books and writing articles about religion in papers. He died suddenly one night. In fact, he was found dead in his bed in the morning. The doctor said it was due to failure of heart. Since his death he has come and slept in the room, which was his when he was alive and is his still. All that he takes is a glass of water fetched from the sacred river Ganges. We put the glass of water in the room and make the bed every evening. The next morning the glass is found empty and the bed appears to have been slept upon. "But why did you begin?" I asked. "Oh, one night he appeared to me in a dream, and asked me to keep the water and a clean bed in the room. This was about a month after his death," said my host. "Has anybody ever passed a night in the room to see what really happens?" I asked. "His young wife, or rather widow, passed a night in that room. The next morning we found her on the bed, sleeping, dead from heart failure, so the doctors said." "Most wonderful and interesting," I remarked. "Nobody has gone to that part of the house since the death of the poor young widow," said my host. "I have got all the doors of the room securely screwed up except one, and that too is kept carefully locked, and the key is always with me." After dinner my host took me to the haunted room. All arrangements for the night were being made, and the bed was neat and clean. A glass of the Ganges water was kept in a corner with a cover on it. I looked at the doors. They were all perfectly secure. The only door that could open was then closed and locked. My host smiled at me sadly. "We won't do all this uselessly," he said. "This is a very costly trick if you think it's a trick at all, because I have to pay to the servants double the amount that others pay in this village, otherwise they would run away. You can sleep at the door and see that nobody gets in at night." I said, "I believe you most implicitly, and need not take the precaution suggested." I was then shown into my room, and everybody withdrew. My room was 4 or 5 apartments off, and of course these apartments were to be unoccupied. As soon as my host and the servants had withdrawn, I took up my candle and went out to the locked door of the ghostly room. With lighted candle I covered the back of the lock with a thin coating of soot or lampblack. Then I scraped off a little dried-up whitewash from the wall and sprinkled the powder over the lampblack. "If anybody disturbs the lock at night I shall know it in the morning," I thought. Well, the reader could guess that I had not a good sleep that night. I got up at about 4:30 in the morning and went to the locked door. My seal was intact. That is, the lamp black with the powdered lime was there just as I had left it. I took out my handkerchief and wiped the lock clean. The whole operation took about 5 minutes. Then I waited. At about 5 my host came and a servant with him. The locked door was opened in my presence. The glass of water was dry, and there was not a drop of water in it. The bed had been slept upon. There was a distinct mark on the pillow where the head should have been, and the sheet too looked as if somebody had been in the bed the whole night. I left the same day by the afternoon train, having passed about 23 hours with the family in the haunted house. End of story 21. Story 22 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. What Uncle Saw by S. Mukherjee. This story need not have been written. It is too sad and too mysterious, but since reference has been made to it in this book, it is only right that readers should know this sad account. Uncle was a very strong and powerful man, and used to boast a good deal of his strength. He was employed in a government office in Calcutta. He used to come to his village home during the holidays. He was a widower with 1 or 2 children, who stayed with his brother's family in the village. Uncle had no bedroom of his own since his wife's death. Whenever he paid us a visit, one of us used to place his bedroom at Uncle's disposal. It is a custom in Bengal to sleep with one's wife and children in the same bedroom. So whenever Uncle turned up, I used to give my bedroom to him, as I was the only person without children. On such occasions I slept in one of the baithaks, drawing rooms. A baithak is a drawing room and a guest room combined. In rich Bengal families of the orthodox style, the baithak or baitak khana is a very large room, generally devoid of all furniture, having a rich thick carpet on the floor, with a clean sheet upon it, and takyas, pillows, all around the walls. The elderly would sit on the ground and lean against their takyas, while we, the younger lot, sat upon the takyas and leaned up against the wall, which in the case of a particular room in our house was covered with some kind of yellow paint, which did not come off on the clothes. Sometimes a takya would burst and the cotton stuffing inside would come out, and then the old servant, his status is that of an English butler, his duty to prepare the hookah for the master, would give us a chase with a lathi, stick, and the offender would run away, and not return until all incriminating evidence had been removed, and the old servant's wrath had subsided. Well, when Uncle used to come, I slept in the batak, and my wife slept somewhere in the zenana. I never inquired where. On this particular occasion Uncle missed the train by which he usually came. It was the month of October, and he should have arrived at 8 p.m. My bed had been made in the batak, but the 8 p.m. train came and stopped and passed on, and Uncle did not turn up. So we thought he had been detained for the night. It was the Durga Puja season, and some presents for the children at home had to be purchased, and we thought that was what was detaining him. And so about 10 p.m. we all retired to bed. The bed that had been made for me in the baithak remained there for Uncle in case he turned up by the 11 p.m. train. As a matter of fact, we did not expect him till the next morning. But as misfortune would have it, Uncle did arrive by the 11 o'clock train. All the household had retired, and though the old servant suggested that I should be waked up, Uncle would not hear of it. He would sleep in the bed originally made for me, he said. The bed was in the central baithak or hall. My uncle was very fond of sleeping in side rooms. I do not know why. Anyhow, he ordered the servant to remove his bed to one of the side rooms. Accordingly, the bed was taken to one of them. One side of that room had 2 windows opening on the garden. The garden was more a park-like place, rather neglected but still well wooded, abounding in jack fruit trees. It used to be quite shady and dark during the day there. On this particular night it must have been very dark. I do not remember now whether there was a moon or not. Well, Uncle went to sleep and so did the servants. It was about 8 o'clock the next morning, when we thought that Uncle had slept long enough, and we went to wake him up. The door connecting the side room with the main baitak was closed, but not bolted from inside, so we pushed the door open and went in. Uncle lay in bed panting. He stared at us with eyes that saw but did not perceive. We at once knew something was wrong. On touching his body we found that he had a high fever. We opened the windows, and it was then that Uncle spoke. "Don't open it or it would come in." "What would come in, Uncle? What?" we asked. But Uncle had fainted. The doctor was called in. He arrived about 10 in the morning. He said it was a high fever, due to what he could not say. All the same he prescribed a medicine. The medicine had the effect of reducing the temperature, and at about 6 in the evening consciousness returned. Still he was in a very weak condition. Some medicine was given to induce sleep, and he passed the night well. We nursed him by turns at night. The next morning we all had the satisfaction of seeing him all right. He walked from the bedroom, though still very weak, and came to the central baitak, where he had tea with us. It was then that we asked what he had seen and what he had meant by "it would come in." Oh, how we wish we had never asked him the question, at least then. This is what he said. "After I had gone to bed, I found that there were a few mosquitoes, and so I could not sleep well. It was about midnight when they gradually disappeared, and then I began to fall asleep. But just as I was dozing off, I heard somebody strike the bars of the windows thrice. It was like 3 distinct strokes, with a cane on the gratings outside. 'Who is there?' I asked, but no reply. The striking stopped. Again I closed my eyes, and again the same strokes were repeated. This time I nearly lost my temper. I thought it was some urchin of the neighborhood in a mischievous mood. 'Who is there?' I again shouted. Again no reply. The striking, however, stopped. But after a time it commenced afresh. This time I lost my temper completely, and opened the window, determined to thrash anybody whom I found there, forgetting that the windows were barred and fully 6 feet above the ground. Well, in the darkness I saw. Here Uncle had a fit of shivering and panting, and within a minute he lost all consciousness. The fever was again high. The doctor was summoned, but this time his medicine did no good. Uncle never regained consciousness. In fact, after 24 hours he died of heart failure the next morning, leaving his story unfinished and without in any way giving us an idea of what terrible thing which he had seen beyond the window. The whole thing remains a deep mystery, and unfortunately the mystery will never be solved. Nobody has ventured to pass a night in the side room since then. If I had not been a married man with a very young wife, I might have tried. One thing, however, remains, and it is this, that though Uncle got all the fright in the world in that room, he neither came out of that room nor called for help. One cry for help and the whole household would have been awake. In fact, there was a servant within 30 yards of the window which Uncle had opened, and this man says he heard Uncle open the window and close and bolt it again, though he had not heard Uncle's shouts of "Who is there?" Only this morning I read this funny advertisement in the Morning Post. Haunted houses. Man and wife, cultured and travelled, gentle people, having lost fortune ready to act as caretakers and to investigate in view of removing trouble. Well, in a haunted house these gentle people expect to see something. Let us hope they will not see what our uncle saw or what the Major saw. This advertisement clearly shows that even in countries like England, haunted houses do exist, or at least houses exist which are believed to be haunted. If what we see really depends on what we think or what we believe, No wonder that there are so many more haunted houses in India than in England. This reminds me of a very old incident of my early school days. A boy was really caught by a ghost, and then there was trouble. We shall not forget the thrashing we received from our teacher in the school, and the fellow who was actually caught by the ghost, if ghost it was, will never say in future that ghosts don't exist. In this connection it may not be out of place to narrate another incident, though it does not fall within the same category with the main story that heads this chapter. The only reason why I do so is that the facts tally in one respect, though in one respect only, and that is that the person who knew would tell nothing. This was a friend of mine who was a widower. We were in the same office together, and he occupied a chair and a table next but one to mine. This gentleman was in our office for only 6 months after narrating the story. If he had stayed longer we might have got out his secret, but unfortunately he went away. He has gone so far from us that probably we shall not meet again for the next 10 years. It was in connection with the Smith's dead wife's photograph controversy that one day one of my fellow clerks told me that a visit from a dead wife was nothing very wonderful, as our friend Harlal could testify. I always took a lot of interest in ghosts and their stories. So I was generally at Harlal's desk cross-examining him about this affair. At first the gentleman was very uncommunicative. But when he saw I would give him no rest he made a statement which I have every reason to believe is true. This is more or less what he says. It was about 10 years ago that I joined this office. I have been a widower ever since I left college. In fact, I married the daughter of a neighbor when I was at college, and she died about 3 years afterwards, when I was just thinking of beginning life in right earnest. She has been dead these 10 years, and I shall never marry again. A young widower in good circumstances in Bengal is as rare as a blue rose. I have a suite of bachelor rooms in Calcutta, but I go to my suburban home on every Saturday afternoon and stay there till Monday morning. That is, I pass my Saturday night and the whole of Sunday in my village home every week. On this particular occasion nearly 8 years ago, that is, about a year and a half after the death of my young wife, I went home by an evening train. There is any number of trains in the evening, and there is no certainty by which train I go, so if I am late, generally everybody goes to bed with the exception of my mother. On this particular night I reached home rather late. It was the month of September, and there had been a heavy shower in the town and all the tramcar services had been suspended. When I reached the railway station I found that the trains were not running to time either. I was given to understand that a tree had blown down against the telegraph wire, and so the signals were not going through. And as it was rather dark, the trains were only running on the report of a motor trolley that the line was clear. Thus I reached home about 11 instead of 8 in the evening. I found my father also sitting up for me, though he had had his dinner. He wanted to learn the particulars of the storm at Calcutta. Within 10 minutes of my arrival he went to bed, and within an hour I finished my dinner and retired for the night. It was rather stuffy and the bed was damp as I was perspiring freely, and consequently I was not feeling inclined to sleep. A little after midnight I felt that there was somebody else in the room. I looked at the closed door. Yes, there was no mistake about it. It was my wife who had been dead these 18 months. At first well, you can guess my feeling. Then she spoke. "There is a cool bed mat under the bedstead. It is rather dusty, but it will make you comfortable." I got up and looked under the bedstead. Yes, the cool bed mat was there, right enough, and it was dusty too. I took it outside and I cleaned it by giving it a few jerks. Yes, I had to pass through the door at which she was standing within 6 inches of her. Don't put any questions. Let me tell you as much as I like. You will get nothing out of me if you interrupt. Yes, I passed a comfortable night. She was in that room for a long time, telling me lots of things. The next morning my mother inquired with whom I was talking, and I told her a lie. I said I was reading my novel aloud. They all know it at home now. She comes and passes 2 nights with me in the week when I am at home. She does not come to Calcutta. She talks about various matters, and she is happy. Don't ask me how I know that. I shall not tell you whether I have touched her body, because that will give rise to further questions. Everybody at home has seen her, and they all know what I have told you, but nobody has spoken to her. They all respect and love her. Nobody is afraid. In fact, she never comes except on Saturday and Sunday evenings, and that when I am at home. No amount of cross-examination, coaxing, or inducement made my friend Harlal say anything further. This story in itself would not probably have been delivered, but after the incident of his dead wife's picture, nobody believed it, and there is no reason why anybody should. Harlal is not a man who would tell yarns, and then I have made inquiries at Harlal's village where several persons know this much, that his dead wife pays him a visit twice every week. Now that Harlal is 500 miles from his village home, I do not know how things stand, but I am told that this story reached the ears of the Bara Sahib, and he asked Harlal if he would object to a transfer, and Harlal told him that he would not. I shall leave the reader to draw his own conclusions. End of Story 22. Story 22 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Boy Who Was Caught by S. Mukherjee. Nothing is more common in India than seeing a ghost. Every one of us has seen a ghost at some period of his existence, and if we have not actually seen one, some other person has, and has given us such a vivid description that we cannot but believe to be true what we hear. This is, however, my own experience. I am told others have observed the phenomenon before. When we were boys at school, we used, among other things, to discuss ghosts. Most of my fellow students asserted that they did not believe in ghosts, but I was one of those who did not only believe in their existence, but also in their power to do harm to human beings, if they liked. Of course, I was in the minority. It was a matter of fact I knew that all those who said that they did not believe in ghosts told a lie. They believed in ghosts as much as I did, only they had not the courage to admit their weakness and differ boldly from the skeptics. Among the lot of unbelievers was one Ram Lal, a student of the 5th Standard, who swore that he did not believe in ghosts, and further that he would do anything to convince us that they did not exist. It was therefore, at my suggestion, that he decided to go one moonlight night and hammer down a wooden peg into the soft sandy soil of the Hindu burning ghat, it being well known that the ghosts generally put in a visible appearance at a burning ghat on a moonlight night. A burning ghat is the place where dead bodies of Hindus are cremated. It was the warm month of April, and the river had shrunk into the size of a nula or drain. The real Puka Ghat, the bathing place, built of bricks and lime, was about 200 yards from the water of the main stream, with a stretch of stand between. The ghats are only used in the morning when people come to bathe, and in the evening they are all deserted. After a game of football on the school grounds, we sometimes used to come and sit on the Puka Ghat for an hour and return home after nightfall. Now it was the 23rd of April, and a bright moonlight night. Every one of us, there were about a dozen, had told the people at home that there was a function at the school, and he might be late. On this night it was arranged that the ghost test should take place. The boy who had challenged the ghost, Ram Lal, who was to join us at the Puka Ghat at 8 p.m., And then while we waited there he would walk across the sand and drive the peg into the ground at the place where a dead body had been cremated that very morning. We were to supply the peg and the hammer. I had to pay the school gardener 2 annas for the loan of a peg and hammer. Well, we procured the peg and the hammer, and proceeded to the Pukagat. If the gardener had known what we required the peg and hammer for, I'm sure he would not have lent them to us. Though I was a firm believer in ghosts, yet I did not expect that Ram Lal would be caught. What I hoped for was that he would not turn up at the trysting place. But to my disappointment Ram Lal did turn up, and at the appointed hour too. He came boasting as usual, took the peg and the hammer and started across the sand, saying he would break the head of any ghost who might venture within the reach of the hammerhead. Well, he went along and we waited for his return at the Pukagat. It was a glorious night. The whole expanse of sand was shining in the bright moonlight. On and on went Ram Lal, with the peg in his left hand and the hammer in his right. He was dressed in the usual up-country Indian style, in a long coat or akan which reached well below his knees and fluttered in the breeze. As he went on his pace slackened. When he had gone about half the distance he stopped and looked back. We hoped he would return. He put down the hammer and the peg, sat down on the sand facing us, took off his shoes. Only some sand had got in. He took up the peg and hammer and walked on. But then we felt that his courage was oozing away. Another 50 yards and he again stopped and looked back at us. Another 50 yards remained. Will he return? No, he again proceeded, but we could clearly see that his footsteps were less jaunty than when he had started. We knew that he was trembling. We knew that he would have blessed us to call him back. But we would not yield, neither would he. Looking in our direction at every step he proceeded, and reached the burning Ghat. He reached the identical spot where the pyre had been erected in the morning. There was very little breeze, not a mouse stirring. Not a soul was within 200 yards of him, and he could not expect much help from us. How poor Ram Lal's heart must have palpitated. When we see Ram Lal now, how we feel that we should burst. Well, Ram Lal knelt down, fixed the peg in the wet sandy soil and began hammering. After each stroke he looked at us and at the river and in all directions. He struck blow after blow, and we counted about 30. That his hands had become nerveless we would understand, for otherwise a dozen strokes should have been enough to make the peg vanish in the soft sandy soil. The peg went in and only about a couple of inches remained visible above the surface, and then Ram Lal thought of coming back. He was kneeling still. He tried to stand up, gave out a shrill cry for help and fell down face foremost. It must have been his cry for help that made us forget our fear of the ghost, and we all ran at top speed towards the Ghat. It was rather difficult to run fast on the sand, but we managed it as well as we could, and stopped only when we were about half a dozen yards from the unconscious form of Ram Lal. There he lay senseless as if gone to sleep. Our instinct told us that he was not dead. We thanked God, and each one of us sent up a silent prayer. Then we cried for help, and a boatman who lived a quarter of a mile away came up. He took up Ram Lal in his arms, and as he was doing it, trrr, went Ram Lal's long coat. The unfortunate lad had hammered the skirt of his long coat along with the peg into the ground. We took Ram Lal to his house and explained to his mother that he had had a bad fall in the football field, and there we left him. The next morning at school, one student who was a neighbor of Ram Lal told us that the whole mischief had become known. Ram Lal, it appears, got high fever immediately after we had left him, and at about midnight he became delirious, and in that condition he disclosed everything in connection with his adventure at the Ghat. In the evening we went to see him. His parents were very angry with us. The whole story reached the ears of the school authorities, and we got what I thought I richly deserved, for having allowed any mortal being to defy a ghost, but what I need not say. Ramlal is now a grown-up young man. He holds a responsible government appointment, and I meet him sometimes when he comes to tour in our part of the province. I always ask him if he has seen a ghost since we last met. In this connection it will not be out of place to mention two simple stories, one from my own experience and another told by a friend. I shall tell my friend's story first, in his own words. I used to go for a bath in the Ganges early every morning. I used to start from home at 4 o'clock in the morning and walk down to the Ganges, which was about 3 miles from my house. The bath took about an hour, and then I used to come back in my carriage, which went for me at about 6 in the morning. On this eventful morning when I woke, it was brilliant moonlight, and so I thought it was dawn. I started from home without looking at the clock, and when I was about 1.5 miles from home, and about the same distance from the river, I realized that I was rather early. The policeman under the railway bridge told me that it was only 2 o'clock. I knew that I should have to cross the small median through which the road ran, and I remembered that there was a rumor that a ghost had sometimes been seen in the median and on the road. This, however, did not make me nervous, because I really did not believe in ghosts. But all the same I wished I could have gone back. But then in going back I should have to pass the policeman, and he would think that I was afraid, so I decided to go on. When I entered the median a creepy sensation came over me. My first idea was that I was being followed, but I did not dare look back. All the same I went on with quick steps. My next idea was that a gust of wind swept past me, and then I thought that a huge form was passing over the trees which lined the road. By this time I was in the middle of the median, about 1/2 mile from the nearest human being. And then, horror of horrors, a huge form came down from the trees, and stood in the middle of the road about 100 yards ahead of me, barring my way. I instinctively moved to the side, but did not stop. By the time I reached the spot, I had left the middle portion of the road and was actually passing under the roadside trees, allowing their thick trunks to intervene between me and the huge form standing in the middle of the road. I did not look at it, but I was sure it was extending a gigantic arm towards me. It could not, however, catch me, and I walked on with vigorous strides. After I passed the figure, I nearly ran under the trees, my heart beating like a sledge-hammer within me. After a couple of minutes I saw 2 glaring eyes in front of me. This I thought was the end. The eyes were advancing towards me at a rapid pace, and then I heard a shout like that of a cow in distress. I stopped where I was. I hoped the ghost would pass along the road overlooking me. But when the ghost was within, say 50 yards of me, it gave another howl, and I knew that it had seen me. A cry for help escaped my lips, and I fainted. When I regained consciousness, I found myself on the grassy footpath by the side of the road, about 4 or 5 human beings hovering about me and a motor car standing near. Then the whole mystery became clear as daylight. The eyes that I had seen were the headlights of the 24 HP Silent Night Minerva of Captain. He had gone on a pleasure trip to the next station and was returning home with 2 friends and his wife in his motor car, when in that part of the road he saw something like a man standing in the middle of the road and sounded his horn. As the figure in the middle of the road would not move aside, he slowed down and then heard my cry. The rest the reader may guess. The figure that had loomed so large with outstretched arm was only a municipal danger sign erected in the middle of the road. A red lamp had been placed on top of the erection, but it had been blown out. This was the whole story of my friend. It shows how even our prosaic but overwrought imagination sometimes gives to airy nothings a local habitation and a name. My own personal experience, which I shall describe now, will also, I am sure, be interesting. It was on a brilliant moonlight night in the month of June that we were sleeping in the open courtyard of our house. Of course, the courtyard had a wall all around with a partition in the middle. On one side of the partition slept 3 girls of the family, and on the other were the younger male members, 4 in number. It was our custom to have a long chat after dinner and before retiring to bed. On this particular night the talk had been about ghosts. Of course the girls were always ready to believe everything, and so when we left them we knew that they would not sleep very comfortably that night. We retired to our part of the courtyard, but we could overhear the conversation of the girls. One was trying to convince the other 2 that ghosts did not exist, and if they did exist they never came into contact with human beings. Then we fell asleep. How long we had slept we did not know, but a sudden cry from one of the girls awoke us, and within 3 seconds we were across the low partition wall, and with her. She was sitting up in bed pointing with fingers. Following the direction we saw in the clear moonlight the figure of a short woman standing in the corner of the courtyard about 20 yards from us, pointing her finger at something, not towards us. We looked in that direction, but could see nothing peculiar there. Our first idea was that it was one of the maidservants, who had heard our after-dinner conversation, playing the ghost. But this particular ghost lady was very short, much shorter than any servant in the establishment. After some hesitation, all 4 of us advanced towards the ghost. I remember how my heart throbbed as I advanced with the other 3 boys. Then we laughed loud and long. What do you think it was? It was only the lawn tennis net wrapped round the pole standing against the wall. The handle of the ratchet arrangement looked like an extending finger. But from a distance in the moonlight it looked exactly like a short woman draped in white. This story again shows that trick our imagination plays with us at times. Talking of ghosts reminds me of a very funny story told by a friend of my grandfather, a famous medical man of Calcutta. This famous doctor was once sent for to treat a gentleman at Agra. This gentleman was a rich Maori who was suffering from indigestion. When the doctor reached Agra, he was lodged in very comfortable quarters and a number of horses and carriages was placed at his disposal. He was informed that the patient had been treated by all the local and provincial practitioners but without any result. The doctor, who was a clever man of the world as of medicine, at once saw there was nothing really the matter with the patient. He was really suffering from a curious malady which could in a phrase be called want of physical exercise. Agra, the city after which the province is named, abounds in old magnificent buildings which it takes the tourist a considerable time to see, and the doctor, of course, was enjoying all the sights in the meantime. He also prescribed a number of medicines which proved of no avail. The doctor had anticipated it, and so he had decided what medicine he would prescribe next. During the sightseeing excursions into the environs of the city, the doctor had discovered a large pucca well not far from a main street and at a distance of 3 miles from his patient's house. It was a very old disused well, and it was generally rumored that a ghost dwelt in it. So nobody would go near the well at night. Of course, there was a lot of stories as to what the ghost looked like and how he came out at times and stood on the brink and all that, but the doctor really did not believe any of these. He, however, believed that this ghost, whether there really was any or not in that well, would cure his patient. So one morning when he saw his patient, he said, "Lala Sahib, I have found out the real cause of your trouble. It is a ghost whom you've got to propitiate, and unless you do that, you will never get well, and no medicine will help you and your digestion will never improve." "A ghost?" asked the patient. "A ghost," exclaimed the people round. "A ghost," said the doctor sagely. "What shall I have to do?" inquired the patient anxiously. "You will have to go every morning to that well," indicating the one mentioned above, "and throw a basketful of flowers in," said the doctor. "I shall do that every day," said the patient. "Then we shall begin from tomorrow," said the doctor. The next morning everybody had been ready to start long before the doctor was out of bed. He came at last and got all up to start. Then a big landau and a pair drew up to take the doctor and the patient to the abode of the ghost in the well. Just as the patient was thinking of getting in, the doctor said, "We don't require a carriage, Lala Sahib. We shall all have to walk, and barefooted too, and between you and me we shall have to carry the basket of flowers also." The patient was really troubled. Never indeed in his life had he walked a mile, not to say of 3, and that barefooted, and carrying a basket of flowers in his hands. However, he had to do it. It was a goodly procession. The big millionaire, the big doctor with a large number of followers walking barefooted, caused amazement and amusement to all who saw them. It took them a full hour and a half to reach the well, and there the doctor pronounced the mantra in Sanskrit, and the flowers were thrown in. The mantra, charm, was in Sanskrit. The doctor, who knew a little of the language, had taken great pains to compose it the night before, and even then it was not grammatically quite correct. At last the party returned, but not on foot. The journey back was performed in the carriages that had followed the patient and his doctor. From that day the practice was followed regularly. The patient's health began to improve, and he began to regain his power of digestion fast. In a month he was all right, but he never discontinued the practice of going to the well and throwing in a basketful of flowers with his own hands. He had also learnt the mantra, the mystic charm, by heart, but the doctor had sworn him to secrecy and he told it to nobody. Shoes with felt sole were soon procured from England, it being 40 years before any Indian rope sole shoe factory came into existence, and thus the inconvenience of walking this distance barefooted was easily obviated. After a month's further stay, the doctor came away from Agra having earned a fabulous fee, and he always received occasional letters and presents from his patient, who never discontinued the practice of visiting the well till his death about 17 years later. "The 3-mile walk is all that he requires," said the doctor to his friends, among whom evidently my grandfather was one, on his return from Agra. "And since he has got used to it now, he won't discontinue, even if he comes to know of the deception I have practiced on him, and I have cured his indigestion after all." The patient, of course, never discovered the fraud. He never gave the matter his serious consideration. His friends, who were as ignorant and prejudiced as he himself was, believed in the ghost as much as he did himself. The medical practitioners of Agra, who were probably in the doctor's secret, never told him anything, and if they had told him anything, they would probably have heard language from our patient that could not well be described as quite parliamentary, for they had all tried to cure him and failed. This series of stories will prove how much imagination works upon the external organs of a human being. If a person goes about with the idea that there is a ghost somewhere about, he will probably see the ghost in everything. But has it ever struck the reader that sometimes horses and dogs do not quite enjoy going to a place which is reputed to be haunted? In a village in Bengal not far from my home, there is a big jackfruit tree which is said to be haunted. I visited this place once. The local zamindar had sent me his elephant. The gomashta, estate manager, who knew that I had come to see the haunted tree, told me that I should probably see nothing during the day, but the elephant would not go near the tree. I passed the tree. It was about 3 miles from the railway station. There was nothing extraordinary about it. This was about 11 o'clock in the morning. Then I went to the shooting box, usually called the kachari or courthouse, where the zamindars and their servants put up when they pay a visit to this part of their processions, to have my bath and breakfast most hospitably provided by my generous host. I ordered that the elephant be put under this tree, and this was done though the people there told me that the elephant would not remain there long. At about 2 p.m. I heard an extraordinary noise from the tree. It was only the elephant. It was wailing and looking as bad as it possibly could. We all went there but found nothing. The elephant was not ill. I ordered it to be taken away from under the tree. As soon as the chain was removed from the animal's foot, it rushed away like a racehorse, and would not stop within 200 yards of the tree. I was vastly amused. I had never seen an elephant running before, but under the tree we found nothing. What made the elephant so afraid has remained a secret. The servants told me, what I had heard before, that it was only elephants, horses, and dogs that did not stay long under that tree. No human eyes have ever seen anything supernatural or fearful there. End of story 23. Story 24 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Starving Millionaire by S. Mukherjee. This story was also in the papers. It created a sensation at the time. Now it has been almost forgotten. The story shows that black art with all its mysteries is not a thing of the past. This is what happened. There was a certain rich European contractor in the central provinces of India. Let us call him Anderson. He used to supply stone ballast to the railway companies, and had been doing this business for over a quarter of a century. He had accumulated wealth, and was a multimillionaire, and one of the richest men in his part of the country. The district which he made his headquarters was a large one. It was a second-class military station, and there were 2 European regiments and 1 Indian regiment in that station. Necessarily there was a number of European military officers besides a number of civil and executive officers in that station. On a certain June morning, which is a very hot month in India, an Indian fakir came into the compound of Mr. Anderson, begging for alms. Mr. Anderson and his wife were sitting in the veranda drinking their morning tea. It had been a very hot night, and there being no electricity in this particular station, Mr. Anderson had to depend on the sleepy punkah coolie. The punkah coolie on this particular night was more sleepy than usual, and so Mr. Anderson had passed a very sleepless night indeed. He was in a very bad temper. A whole life passed among Indian workmen does not generally make a man good-tempered, and a hot June in the Indian plains is not particularly conducive to sweet temper either. When this beggar came in, Mr. Anderson was in a very bad mood. As the man walked fearlessly up to the veranda, Mr. Anderson's temper became worse. He asked what the beggar wanted. The beggar answered he wanted food. Of course, Mr. Anderson said he had nothing to give. The beggar replied that he would accept some money and buy the food. Mr. Anderson was not in the habit of being contradicted. He lost his temper, abused the beggar, and ordered his servants to turn the man out. The servants obeyed. Before his departure, the beggar turned to Mr. Anderson and told him that very soon he would know how painful it was to be hungry. When the beggar was gone, Mr. Anderson thought of his last remark and laughed. He was a well-known rich man and a good paymaster. An order for £100 on a dirty slip of paper would be honored by his banker without hesitation. Naturally he laughed. He forgot that men had committed suicide by drowning to avoid death from thirst. Well, there it was. The bell announcing breakfast rang punctually at 10 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Anderson joined his wife in the drawing-room, and they went to the dining-room together. The smell of eggs and bacon and coffee greeted them, and Mr. Anderson forgot all about the Indian beggar when he took his seat. But he received a rude shock. There was a big live caterpillar in the fish. Mr. Anderson called the servant and ordered him to take away the fish and serve with eyes open next time. The servant, who had been in Mr. Anderson's service a long time, stared open-mouthed. Only a minute before there was nothing but fish on the plate. Whence came this ugly creature? Well, the plate was removed, and another put in its place for the next dish. When the next dish came, another surprise awaited everybody. As the cover was removed, it was found that the whole contents were covered with a thin layer of sweepings. The khansama, the servant who serves at the table, looked at Mr. Anderson, and Mr. Anderson at the khansama with a wild surmise. The cover was replaced and the dish taken away. Nothing was said this time. After about 5 minutes of waiting, a third covered dish was brought. When the cover was removed, the contents were found mixed with stable sweepings. The smell was horrible, and the dish was at once removed. This was about the limit. No man can eat after that. Mr. Anderson left the table and went to his office, without breakfast. It was the habit of Mr. Anderson to have his lunch in his office. A khansama used to take a tiffin basket to the office, and there, in his private room, Mr. Anderson ate his lunch punctually at 2 p.m. Today he expected his tiffin early. He thought that though he had left no instructions himself, the khansama would have had the sense to remember that he had gone to the office without breakfast. And so Mr. Anderson expected a lunch heavier than usual and earlier too. But it was 2 o'clock and the servant had not arrived. Mr. Anderson was a man of particular regular habits. He was very hungry, and the thought of the beggar in the morning made him angry too. He shouted to his punkah coolie to pull harder. It was 2:15 and still the khansama would not arrive. It was probably the first time in 20 years that the fellow was late. Mr. Anderson sent his chaprassi, peon, to look for the khansama at about 2:30. A couple of minutes after the chaprassi's departure, Mr. Atkins, the collector of the district, was announced. A collector is generally a district magistrate also, and in the central provinces he is called a deputy commissioner. He is one of the principal officers in the district. In this particular district of which I am speaking, there are 2 principal government officers. The divisional judge was the head of the civil administration as well as the person who tried the murderers and all other big offenders who deserved more than 7 years' imprisonment. He was a Bengal Brahmin. Mr. Atkins was the collector, or rather the deputy commissioner. He was the executive head of the district. He was also the district magistrate. Mr. Atkins came in and thus explained a sad incident which Mr. Anderson's khansama had met with. As I was passing along the road in my motor car, your young man came in the way and was knocked down. The man is hurt, but not badly. He had been carrying a tiffin basket which was also knocked down, as a matter of course, and the car having passed over it, everything the basket contained in the shape of china was smashed up. The man has been taken to the hospital by myself in an unconscious condition, but the doctor says there is nothing very serious, and he will be all right in a couple of days. Now Mr. Atkins was a great friend of Mr. Anderson. They had known each other ever since Mr. Atkins' arrival in India as a young member of the civil service. That was over 20 years ago. He had at first been in that district for over 7 years as an assistant commissioner, and this time he was there for over 3 years as a deputy commissioner. But Mr. Anderson was very hungry. The story of Mr. Atkins had given him the second shock since the morning. He therefore used language which no gentleman should have done, and with great vehemence threatened to prosecute Mr. Atkins for rash driving, etc. Mr. Atkins was a very good-natured man. He knew the temper of Mr. Anderson, but he had never seen Mr. Anderson so angry before. He therefore beat a hasty retreat, wondering whether Anderson had not gone mad. He would not have told anybody what happened in Anderson's office if he had known the starving condition of the millionaire. But as it happened, he repeated the fine language that Anderson had used in the club that same evening. Everybody who heard his story opined at the time that Anderson was clearly off his head. Mr. Anderson and his wife were expected at the club, but they did not turn up. When Mr. Atkins went home he got a letter from Anderson in which the latter had apologized for what he had said in the office that afternoon. In the letter there was a sentence which was rather enigmatic. "If you know what I'm suffering from, Atkins, you will be sorry for me, not angry with me. I pray to God you may not suffer such." The letter had evidently been written in great haste, and had not been revised. Mr. Atkins did not quite understand the matter, and he intended to look up Anderson the first thing next morning. Mr. Atkins thought that Anderson had lost some of his money. He knew that Anderson never speculated. Still, he might have suffered a heavy loss in one of his contracts. He telephoned to Mr. Anderson at his house, but was informed by one of the servants that the master had gone out in his motor car at 6 in the evening and was not back. Now let's see what happened to Mr. Anderson after he left his office at about 4 in the afternoon. He went home and expected some tea, but no tea arrived, though it was 6. The khansama was in the hospital. The cook was called, and he humbly offered the following explanation. "As soon as Hazor, Your Honor, came back I ordered the khidmatgar, the cook assistant, to put the kettle on the fire. This is the ordinary duty of the khidmatgar." There was a bright coal fire in the stove, and the khidmatgar put the kettle upon it. The kettle should have boiled within 5 minutes, but it did not. Your humble servant went to investigate the cause, and found there was no water in the kettle. We put in some, but the kettle had in the meantime become nearly red hot. As soon as it came into contact with the cold water, it burst like a bomb. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. There was, of course, a saucepan to heat some water in, but the cold water had got on to the stove and extinguished it. It would be another half an hour before tea was ready, he added. Mr. Anderson now realized that it was not the fault of the servants, but the curse of the Indian fakir. So with a sad smile he ordered his motor car, and thought that he and his wife had better try the railway refreshment rooms. When his chauffeur was going to start the engine, Mr. Anderson expected that there would be a backfire and the chauffeur would have a dislocated wrist. But there was no accident. The engine started as smoothly as it had never done before. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson went to the railway refreshment rooms. There they were informed that no tea was available. A dead rat had been found under one of the tables in the first-class refreshment room, and as plague cases had been reported earlier in the week, the station master had ordered the rooms to be closed till they had been thoroughly disinfected. The whole staff of waiters with all the preserved meat and oilmen's stores had been sent by special train to the next station, so that the railway passengers might not be inconvenienced. The next station was 8 miles off, and there was no road for a motor car. "I had expected as much," said Mr. Anderson bitterly, as he left the railway station. "I would go to Captain Fraser and beg for some dinner. He is the only man who has got a family here, and will be able to accommodate us," he said to his wife, and so they started off a 5-mile run to the cantonments. There was some trouble with the car on the way, and they were detained for about an hour, and it was actually 8:30 in the evening when the Andersons reached Captain Fraser's place. Why, instead of going home from the railway station, Mr. Anderson went to Captain Fraser's place himself, could not tell. When the Andersons reached Captain Fraser's place at 8:30 in the evening, Mr. and Mrs. Fraser had not come back from the club, but they were expected every minute. It was in fact 9 when the captain and his wife turned up in a hackney carriage. They were surprised to see the Andersons. They had heard the story told by Atkins at the club. Anderson gave them his version. Of course, Captain Fraser asked them to stay to dinner. He said, "I am very sorry I am late, but it couldn't be helped. When returning from the club, my horse was alarmed at something. The coachman lost control and there was a disaster. But thank God, nobody is seriously hurt." Their carriage had, however, been so badly damaged that they had to get a hackney carriage to bring them home. In India, especially in June, they are not particular about the dress. So Captain Fraser said they would sit down to dinner at once, and at 9:15 they all went in to dine. The khansama stared at the uninvited guests. He knew that something had gone wrong with Anderson Sahib. The soup was the first thing brought in, and the trouble began as soon as it came. Captain Fraser's khansama was an old hand at his business, but somehow he made a mess of things. He got so nervous about what he himself could not explain that he upset a full plate of soup that he had brought for Mr. Anderson, not exactly on his head, but on his left ear. Well, the reader would understand the situation. There was a plateful of hot soup on Mr. Anderson's left ear. The soup should have got cold, because it had waited long for the captain's return from the club, but the cook had very prudently warmed it up again, and it had become very warm indeed. Mr. Anderson shouted, and the khansama let go the plate. It fell on the table in front of Mr. Anderson on its edge and rolled on. Next to Mr. Anderson was Mrs. Fraser, and there was a glass of iced water in front of her. The rolling soup plate upset the glass, and the water and the glass and the plate all came down on Mrs. Fraser's lap, the iced water making her wet through and through. She was putting on a muslin gown. She had to go and change. Mrs. Anderson at this point got up and said that they would not spoil the Frasers' dinner by their presence. She said that the curse of the Indian fakir was on them, and if they stayed the Frasers would have to go without dinner. Naturally, she anticipated that some further difficulty would arise there when the next dish was brought in. The Frasers protested loudly, but she dragged Mr. Anderson away. She had forgotten that she had had her lunch and her husband had not. While going in their motor car from Mr. Fraser's house to their own, they had to pass a bazaar on the way. In the bazaar there was a sweetmeat shop. Mr. Anderson, whose condition could be better imagined than described, asked his chauffeur to stop at the sweetmeat shop. It was a native shop with a fat native proprietor sitting without any covering upon his body on a low stool. As soon as he saw Mr. Anderson and his wife, he rushed out of his shop with joined palms to inquire what the gentleman wanted. Mr. Anderson was evidently very popular with the native tradesmen and shopkeepers. This shopkeeper had special reason to know Mr. Anderson, as it was the latter's custom to give a dinner to all his native workmen on Her Majesty's birthday, and this particular sweetmeat vendor used to get the contract for the catering. The birthday used to be observed in India on the 24th May, and it was hardly a fortnight that this man had received a check for a pretty large amount from Mr. Anderson, for having supplied Mr. Anderson's native workmen with sweets. Naturally, he rushed out of his shop in that humble attitude. But in doing so he upset a whole dishful of sweets, and the big dish with the sweets went into the roadside drain. All the same, the man came up and wanted to know the pleasure of the Sahib. Mr. Anderson told him that he was very hungry and wanted something to eat. "Certainly, Huzur," said the Halwai Indian confectioner, and fussily rushed in. He brought out some native sweets in a dona, cup made of leaves, but as misfortune would have it, Mr. Anderson could not eat anything. There was any amount of petroleum in the sweets. How it got in there was a mystery. Mr. Anderson asked his chauffeur to proceed. For fear of hurting the feeling of this kind old Halwai, Mr. Anderson did not do anything then, but scarcely had the car gone 200 yards when the dona with its contents untouched was on the road. Mr. Anderson reached home at about 10:30. He expected to find no dinner at home, but he was relieved to hear from his bearer that dinner was ready. He rushed into his bathroom, had a cold bath, and within 5 minutes was ready for dinner in the dining room. But the dinner would not come. After waiting for about 15 minutes, the bearer, butler and footman combined, was dispatched to the kitchen to inquire what the matter was. The cook came with a sad look upon his face and informed him that the dinner had been ready since 8:30 as usual, but as the sahib had not returned, he had kept the food in the kitchen and come out leaving the kitchen door open. Unfortunately, Mr. Anderson's dogs had finished the dinner in his absence, probably thinking that the master was dining out. In a case like this, the cook, who had been in Mr. Anderson's service for a long time, expected to hear some hard words, but Mr. Anderson only laughed loud and long. The cook suggested that he should prepare another dinner, but Mr. Anderson said that it would not be necessary that night. The chauffeur subsequently informed the cook that the master and his wife had dined at Captain Fraser's, and finished with sweets at Gopal Halwai's shop. This explained the master's mirth to the cook's satisfaction. What happened the next day to Mr. Anderson need not be told. It is too painful and too dirty a story. The fact remains that Mr. Anderson had no solid food the next day either. He thought he should die of starvation. He did not know how much longer the curse was going to last, or what else was in store for him. On the morning of the third day, the bearer came and reported that a certain Indian fakir had invited Mr. Anderson to go and breakfast with him. How eagerly husband and wife went. The fakir lived in a miserable hut on the bank of the river. He invited the couple inside his hut and gave them bread and water. Here was a clean, healthy-looking bread after all, and Mr. Anderson never counted how many loaves he ate. But he had never eaten food with greater relish and pleasure in his life before. After the meal the fakir, who evidently knew Mr. Anderson, said, "Sahib, you are a great man and a good man too. You are rich and you think that riches can purchase everything. You are wrong. The giver of all things may turn gold into dust, and gold may, by his order, lose all its purchasing capacity. This you have seen the last 2 days. You have annoyed a man who has no gold, but who has power. You think that the deputy commissioner has power, but he has not. The deputy commissioner gets his power from the king. The man whom you have offended got his power from the King of Kings. It is his pleasure that you should leave the station. The sooner you leave this place, Sahib, the better for you, or you will starve. You can stay as long as you like here, but you will eat no food outside this hut of mine. You can try. You can go now and come back for your dinner when you require it." Mr. Anderson came back to the fakir's cottage for his dinner, with his wife, at 9 in the evening. Early the next morning he left the station and never came back. Within a month he had left India for good. The hospitable gentleman of the station who had asked Mr. and Mrs. Anderson to have a meal with him will never forget the occasion. This story, though it reads like a fairy tale, is nevertheless true. All the European gentlemen of J knew it, and if any one of them happens to read these pages he will be able to certify that every detail is correct. In this connection it will not be out of place to mention some of the strange things of the once famous Hassan Khan, the black artists of Calcutta. 50 years ago there was not an adult in Calcutta who did not know his name, and had not seen, or at least heard, of his marvelous feats. I have heard any number of wonderful stories, but I shall mention only 2 here which, though evidently not free from exaggeration, will give an idea of what the people came to regard him as capable of achieving, and also of the powers and attributes which he used to arrogate to himself. What happened was this. There was a big reception in a government house at Calcutta. Now a native of Calcutta of those days knew what such a reception meant. All public roads within half a mile of Government House were closed to wheeled and fast traffic. The large compound was decorated with lamps and Chinese lanterns in a manner that baffled description. Thousands of these Chinese lanterns hung from the trees and twinkled among the foliage like so many colored fireflies. The drives from the gates to the building had rows of these colored lanterns on both sides. Besides, there were colored flags and Union Jacks flying from the tops of the poles, round which were coiled wreaths of flowers, which also served to support the ropes or wires from which these lanterns were suspended. The main building itself was illuminated with hundreds of thousands of candles or lamps, and looked from a distance like a house on fire. From close quarters you could read, "Long live the Queen," written in letters of fire on the parapets of the building, and could see the procession of carriages that passed up and down the drive so artistically decorated, and wonder that the spirited horses did not bolt or shy or kick over the traces when entering those lanes of fire. There were no electric lights then in Calcutta or in any part of India, no motor cars, and no rubber-tired carriages. On a reception night lots of people come to watch the decorations of Government House. Nowadays Government House is illuminated with electricity, but I am told by my elders that in those days, when tallow candles and tiny glass lamps were the only means of illumination, the thing looked more beautiful and gorgeous. The people who come to see the illumination pass along the road and are not allowed to stop. The law is that they must walk on, and if a young child stops for more than a half a minute, his guardian, friend, nurse or companion is at once reminded by the policeman on duty that he or she must walk on. And these policemen of Calcutta, unlike the policemen of London, are not at all courteous in their manner or speech. So it happened on a certain reception night that Hassan Khan, the black artist, went to see the decorations, and while lingering on the road was rudely told by the policeman on duty to get away. Ordinarily Hassan Khan was a man of placid disposition and polite manners. He told the policeman that he should not have been rude to a ratepayer who had come only to enjoy the glorious sight and meant no harm. He also dropped a hint that if the head of the police department knew that a subordinate of his was insulting Hassan Khan, it would go hard with that subordinate. This infuriated the policeman, who blew his whistle, which had the effect of bringing half a dozen other constables on the spot. They then gave poor Hassan Khan a thrashing, and reported him to the inspector on duty. As chance would have it, this inspector had not heard of Hassan Khan before, so he ordered that he should be detained in custody and charged the next morning with having assaulted a public officer in the discharge of his duty. The inspector also received a warning, but he did not listen to it. Then Hassan Khan took out a piece of paper and a pencil from his pocket, and wrote down the number of each of the 6 or 7 policemen who had taken part in beating him, and he assured everybody, a large number of persons had gathered now, present, that the constables and the inspector would be dismissed from government service within the next hour. Most of the people had not seen him before, and not knowing who he was, laughed. The inspector and the constables laughed too. After the mirth had subsided, Hassan Khan was ordered to be handcuffed and removed. When the handcuffs had been clapped on he smiled serenely and said, "I order that all the lights within a half a mile of where we are standing be put out at once." Within a couple of seconds the whole place was in darkness. The entire Government House compound, which was a mass of fire only a minute before, was in total darkness, and the street lamps had gone out too. The only light that remained was on the street lamp posts under which our friends were. The commotion at the reception could be more easily imagined than described. There was total darkness everywhere. The guests were treading literally on each other's toes, and the accidents that happened to the carriages and horses were innumerable. As good luck would have it, another police inspector who was also on duty and was on horseback came up to the only light within a circle of a half-mile radius. To him Hassan Khan said, "Go and tell your commissioner of the police that his subordinates have ill-treated Hassan Khan, and tell him that I order him to come here at once." Some laughed, others scoffed, but the inspector on horseback went, and within 10 minutes the commissioner of the Calcutta police came along with half a dozen other high officials, inquiring what the trouble was about. To them, Hassan Khan told the story of the thrashing he had received, and pointed out the assailants. He then told the commissioner that if those constables and the inspector who had ordered him to be handcuffed were dismissed, on the spot, from government service, the lamps would be lighted without human assistance. To the utter surprise of everybody present, including the high officials who had come out with the commissioner of police, an order dismissing the constables and the inspector was passed and signed by the commissioner in the dim light shed by that isolated lamp. And within 1 second of the order, the entire compound of Government House was lighted up again, as if someone had switched on 1,000 electric lamps controlled by a single button. Everybody who was present there enjoyed the whole thing excessively, with the exception of the police officers who had been dismissed from service. It appeared that the commissioner of police knew a lot about Hassan Khan and his black art. How he had come to know of Hassan Khan's powers will now be related. Most of my readers have heard the name of Messrs. Hamilton and Company, jewelers of Calcutta. They are the oldest and most respectable firm of jewelers probably in the whole of India. One day Hassan Khan walked into their shop and asked to see some rings. He was shown a number of rings, but he particularly approved a cheap ring set with a single ruby. The price demanded for this ring was too much for poor honest Hassan Khan's purse, so he proposed that the jeweler should let him have the ring on loan for a month. This, of course, the jewelers refused to do, and in a most un-Englishman-like and unbusinesslike manner, a young shop assistant asked him to clear out. He promptly walked out of the shop, promising to come again the next day. Before going out of the shop, however, he told one of the managers that the young shop assistant had been very rude to him and would not let him have the ring for a month. The next day there was a slight commotion in Hamilton's shop. The ring was missing. Of course, nobody could suspect Hassan Khan because the ring had been seen by everybody in the shop after his departure. The police were communicated with and were soon on the spot. They were examining the room and the locks and recording statements when Hassan Khan walked in with the missing ring on his finger. He was at once arrested, charged with theft and taken to the police station and locked up. At about midday he was produced before the magistrate. When he appeared in court he was found wearing 10 rings, one on each finger. He was remanded and taken back to his cell in the jail. The next morning when the door of his cell was opened, it was found that one of the big almirahs in which some gold and silver articles were kept in Hamilton's shop was standing in his cell. Everybody gazed at it dumbfounded. The almirah with its contents must have weighed 50 stones. How it got into the cell was beyond comprehension. All the big officers of government came in to see the fun and asked Hassan Khan how he had managed it. "How did you manage to get the showcase in your drawing room?" inquired Hassan Khan of each officer in reply to the question. And everybody thought that the fellow was mad. But as each officer reached home, he found that one showcase, evidently from Hamilton's shop, with all its contents was standing in his drawing room. The next morning Hassan Khan gave out in clear terms that unless Messrs. Hamilton and Company withdrew the charge against him, at once they would find their safe in which were kept the extra valuable articles at the bottom of the Bay of Bengal. The jewelers thought that prudence was the best part of valor, and the case against Hassan Khan was withdrawn, and he was acquitted of all charges and set at liberty. Then arose the big question of compensating him for the incarceration he had suffered, and the ring with a single ruby which he had fancied so much and which had caused all this trouble was presented to him. Of course, Messrs. Hamilton and Company, the jewelers, had to spend a lot of money in carting back the showcases that had so mysteriously walked away from their shop. But they were not sorry. because they could not have advertised their ware better, and everybody was anxious to possess something or other from among the contents of these particular showcases. It was in connection with this case that Hassan Khan became known to most of the European government officials of Calcutta at that time. End of story 24. Story 25 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Bridal Party by S. Mukherjee. In Benares, the sacred city of the Hindus, situated in the united provinces of Agra and Oudh, there is a house which is famed pretty far and wide. It is said that the house is haunted and that no human being can pass a night in that house. Once there was a large bridal party. In India, the custom is that the bridegroom goes to the house of the bride with great pomp and show with a number of friends and followers, and the ceremony of Kanyadan, giving away the girl, takes place at the bride's house. The number of people who go with the bridegroom largely depends on the means of the bride's party, because the guests who come with the groom are to be fed and entertained in the right regal style. It is this feeding and entertaining of the guests that makes a daughter's marriage so costly in India, to a certain extent. If the bride and the groom live in the same town or village, then the bridegroom's party goes to the bride's house in the evening. The marriage is performed at night, and they all come away the same night or early the next morning. If, however, the places of residence of the bride and the bridegroom are, say, 500 miles apart, as is generally the case, the bridegroom with his party goes a day or two earlier and stays a day or two after the marriage. The bride's people have to find accommodation, food, and entertainment for the whole period, which in the case of rich people extends over a week. Now I had the pleasure of joining such a bridal party as mentioned last, going to Benares. We were about 30 young men, besides a number of elderly people. Since the young men could not be merry in the presence of their elders, the bride's father, who was a very rich man, had made arrangements to put up the 30 of us in a separate house. This house was within a few yards of the famed haunted house. We reached Benares at about 10 in the morning, and it was about 3 in the afternoon that we were informed that the celebrated haunted house was close by. Naturally, some of us decided that we should occupy that house rather than the one in which we were. I myself was not very keen on shifting, but a few others were. Our host protested, but we insisted, and so the host had to give way. The house was empty and the owner was a local gentleman, a resident of Benares. To procure his permission and the key was the work of a few minutes, and we took actual possession of the house at about 6 in the evening. It was a very large house with big rooms and halls, rather poorly furnished, but some furniture was brought in from the house which we had occupied on our arrival. There was a very big and well-ventilated hall, and in this we decided to sleep. Carpet upon carpet was piled on the floor, and there we decided to sleep, on the ground, in right Oriental style. Lamps were brought and the house was lighted up. At about 9 p.m. our dinner was announced. The Oriental dinner is conducted as follows. All guests sit on the floor, and a big plate of metal, say 20 inches in diameter, is placed in front of each guest. Then the service commences, and the plates are filled with dainties. Each guest generally gets thrice as much as he can eat. Then the host, who does not himself join, stands with joined hands and requests the guests to do full justice, and the dinner begins. Very little is eaten, in fact, and whatever is left over goes to the poor. That is probably the only consolation. Now on this particular occasion the bride's father, who was our host and who was an elderly gentleman, had withdrawn, leaving 2 of his sons to look after us. He himself, we understood, was looking after his more elderly guests who had been lodged in a different house. The hall in which we sat down to dine was a large one and very well lighted. Adjoining it was a hall in which our beds had been made. The sons of mine host, with a number of others, were serving. I always was rather unconventional, so I asked my fellow guests whether I could fall to, and without waiting for permission I commenced eating, a very good thing I did, as would appear hereafter. In about 20 minutes the serving was over and we were asked to begin. As a matter of fact, I was nearly half through at that time, and then the trouble began. With a click, all the lights went out, and the whole house was in total darkness. Of course, the reader can guess what followed. "Who has put out the lights?" shouted Jagat, who was sitting next but one to me on the left. "The ghost!" shouted another in reply. "I shall kill him if I can catch him!" shouted Jagat. The whole place was in darkness. We could not see anything, but we could hear that Jagat was trying to get up. Then he received what was a stunning blow on his back. We could hear the thump. "Oh!" shouted Jagat, "who is that?" He sat down again and gave the man on his right a blow like the one he had received. The man on the right protested. Then Jagat turned to the man on his left. The man on Jagat's left evidently resisted and Jagat had the worst of it. Then Nareen, another one of us, shouted out, "What is the matter with you?" asked his neighbor. "Why did you pull my hair?" shouted Nareen. "I did not pull," shouted the neighbor. Then a servant was seen approaching with a lamp and things became quiet. But the servant did not reach the hall. He stumbled against something and fell headlong on the ground. The lamp went out, and our trouble began again. One of the party received a slap on the back of his head, which sent his cap rolling, and in his attempt to recover it he upset a glass of water that was near his right hand. Matters went on in this fashion till a lamp came. The whole thing must have taken about 4 minutes. When the lamp came we found that all the dishes were clean. The edibles had mysteriously disappeared. The sons of mine host looked stupidly at us, and we looked stupidly at them and at each other. But there it was, there was not a particle of solid food left. We had therefore no alternative but to adjourn to the nearest confectioner's shop and eat some sweets there. That night would not pass in peace, we were sure, but nobody dared suggest that we should not pass the night in the haunted house. Once having defied the ghost, we had to stand to our guns for one night at least. It was well after 11 o'clock at night when we came back and went to bed. We went to bed but could not sleep. The room in which we all slept was a big one, as I have already said, and there were 2 wall lamps in it. We lowered the lamps then the lamps went out, and we began to anticipate trouble. Our hosts had all gone home, leaving us to the tender mercies of the ghost. Shortly afterwards we began to feel as if we were lying on a public road and horses passing along the road within a yard of us. We also imagined we could hear men passing close to us whispering. Sleeping was impossible. We all remained awake talking about different things, till a horse came very near. And thus the night passed away. At about 4 in the morning one of us got up and wanted to go out. We shouted for the servant called Kalu, and within a minute Kalu came with a lantern. One of our fellow guests got up and went out of the room followed by Kalu. We could hear him going along the dining hall to the head of the stairs. Then we heard him shriek. We all rushed out. The lighted lantern was there at the head of the stairs, and our fellow guest at the bottom. Kalu had vanished. We rushed down, picked up our friend and carried him upstairs. He said that Kalu had given him a push and he had fallen down. Fortunately he was not hurt. We called the servants and they all came, Kalu among them. He denied having come with a lantern or having pushed our friend down the stairs. The other servants corroborated his statement. They assured us that Kalu had never left the room in which they all were. We were satisfied that this was also a ghostly trick. At about 7 in the morning when our hosts came, we were glad to bid good-bye to the haunted house with our bones whole. The funniest thing was that only those of my fellow guests had the worst of it who had denied the existence of ghosts. Those of us who had kept respectfully silence had not been touched. Those who had received a blow or two averred that the blows could not have been given by invisible hands, inasmuch the blows were too substantial, but all of us were certain that it was no trick played by a human being. The passing horses and the whispering passers-by had given us a queer, creepy sensation. In this connection may be mentioned a few haunted houses in other parts of India. There are one or two very well-known haunted houses in Calcutta. The Hastings House is one of them. It is situated at Alipur, in the southern suburb of Calcutta. This is a big, palatial building now owned by the government of Bengal. At one time it was the private residence of the Governor-General of India, whose name it bears. At present it is used as the state guest house, in which the Indian chiefs are put up when they come to pay official visits to His Excellency in Calcutta. It appears that in a lane not very far from this house was fought the celebrated duel between Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of India, and Sir Philip Francis, a member of his council and the reputed author of the Letters of Junius. While living in this house, Warren Hastings married Baroness Imhoff, sometime during the first fortnight of August about 140